No calls, no deals, just India's sovereign decision. That's how history is written. That's how empires are shaken. That's how a nation tells the world, we are no longer taking instructions. We are no longer waiting for permission. We are no longer standing in line to be approved. India has walked into a moment in time where every single move carries weight, every silence carries meaning, and every choice sends ripples through the global order. And the beauty of this moment is that it wasn't built overnight. It wasn't given as charity. It wasn't begged for. It was earned the hard way, through sweat, through pain, through humiliation, through patience, through resilience. You see, when a country reaches the point where it can say no calls, no deals, just our sovereign decision, that means it has climbed out of the pit of dependency. It has stopped waiting for the West's nod. It has stopped worrying about who's pleased or who's angry. It has discovered something far more valuable than dollars or tanks or votes in the United Nations. It has discovered self-respect. That's the power the world fears. Because when a nation acts not from fear, not from desperation, not from the promise of aid or sanctions, but from the conviction of its own destiny, then no superpower, no alliance, no corporation can push it back into line. Think about it. For decades, the so-called world order ran on phone calls. A crisis would happen in Asia and Washington would make a call. A decision in Africa and Brussels would send a memo. A problem in the Middle East and London would send a delegation. And nations would comply, not because they agreed, but because they had no choice. They were tied to loans, to weapons, to supply chains, to media narratives. One call was enough to twist an arm. One deal was enough to buy silence. That's how control was maintained. That's how sovereignty was compromised without even firing a shot. But India is now standing in a different space. Today, when the calls come, India listens but doesn't obey. When the deals are offered, India smiles but doesn't beg. When pressure is applied, India absorbs it but doesn't bend, because the foundation of India's power is no longer outside. It is inside. It is built on one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It is powered by 4 billion people who are no longer just a market to be exploited, but a force of innovation, consumption, and creativity. It is secured by a military that isn't just defending borders, but shaping doctrines that other nations now study. And most importantly, it is guided by a civilization that remembers who it is. A civilization that has lasted when others collapsed. A civilization that knows time is on its side. And this, right here, is what the world is struggling to understand. Because the West is used to managing countries with a carrot and stick. Offer them aid, dangle a trade deal, whisper threats about sanctions, and they fall in line. That's the script. That's the movie the world has seen play out for decades. But suddenly, here comes India refusing to audition. No calls, no deals, just sovereign decisions, and that shakes the ground. That terrifies those who built their influence on compliance. Because if India can say no, others will learn to say no too. This isn't just geopolitics. This is psychology, the psychology of freedom, the psychology of standing tall in the middle of giants and saying, we are not afraid. You want to know what that looks like. Look at how India handled oil trade with Russia. The West shouted, threatened, begged, don't buy. India said, we will buy because it's in our interest. No calls, no deals, just a sovereign decision. Look at how India speaks at global summits, not with apology, not with hesitation, but with a clarity that cuts through the noise. No calls, no deals, just a sovereign decision. Look at how India invests in its defense, its space program, its digital revolution. Not waiting for approval, not asking for technology on lease, but building, creating, innovating on its own terms. That is sovereignty in action. And let's be real, sovereignty is expensive. It costs. It means you risk angering the powerful. It means you sacrifice easy money. It means you take the long road when the shortcut is tempting. But the long road builds dignity. The long road builds endurance. The long road makes sure that when you arrive, no one can push you out of your seat, and India has chosen that long road. That's why the world's narrative is shifting. 10 years ago, India was spoken of as an emerging market, a potential player. Today, it's spoken of as a pillar of the multipolar world. Tomorrow, it will be spoken of as a nation that redefined sovereignty for the 21st century. Think about the message this sends to every Indian citizen. For generations, Indians were told their country was dependent. Dependent on foreign investment, dependent on foreign weapons, dependent on foreign recognition. That mindset created hesitation. But today, when they hear their leaders say no calls, no deals, just India's sovereign decision, they hear something new. They hear confidence. They hear pride. They hear the sound of a nation finally seeing itself not as a follower, but as a leader. That's fuel, that's energy, that's the kind of psychological shift that creates entrepreneurs, scientists, soldiers, artists who no longer think second, best, but first class, and don't think the rest of the world doesn't notice. America notices, Europe notices, China notices, Russia notices, Africa notices, Southeast Asia notices. Everyone is recalibrating their strategy because they realize India isn't playing the old game anymore. And here's the truth. The world cannot afford to ignore India. You can't run global trade without India's markets. You can't solve climate change without India's cooperation. You can't secure the Indo-Pacific without India's navy. You can't even shape technology's future without India's engineers. So if India says, no calls, no deals, just our decision, the world has to adjust. That's leverage. That's sovereignty turned into power. Now let's talk about why this matters for the future. We are heading into a multipolar order. That means no one power runs the show anymore. America can't do it alone. China can't do it alone. Europe can't do it alone. It's a table with multiple chairs, and India has earned a seat at that table. But here's the twist. India doesn't just want a seat. India wants to shape the table itself. That means rewriting rules, setting norms, building systems that don't depend on one empire's approval. That's why India is building its own payment networks, its own digital infrastructures, its own defense industries. Because sovereignty in the 21st century isn't just about waving a flag. It's about owning your tools, owning your voice, owning your choices. You see, history has a funny way of repeating. Centuries ago, India was the richest land on earth, and everyone wanted a piece of it. Colonizers came, took control, and ruled by dictating decisions. That era left scars. But today, India is reversing the script. No more colonizers calling the shots. No more foreign companies looting wealth. No more dependency disguised as partnership. This time, India writes its own script. And the world has no choice but to watch. But let me be clear, sovereignty isn't arrogance. It isn't isolation. India isn't saying we don't care about the world. India is saying we will engage with the world, but on equal terms. Respect us, and we respect you. Try to dominate us, and we resist you. That's maturity. That's balance. That's the kind of power that lasts, because it isn't built on ego, but on principle. And principles don't bend with pressure. Now imagine the ripple effect. If India can do this, what stops Africa from doing this? What stops Southeast Asia from doing this? What stops in America from doing this? The world order shifts when one player breaks free from the script. And India is that player, the one who says no to the old game and yes to sovereignty. So let me tell you this, the days of begging are over. The days of dependency are over. The days of waiting for calls and deals are over. A new era has begun, an era where India's voice is not an echo of someone else's demand, but a declaration of its own vision. That's why people across the globe are watching, because deep down they know what this means. It means power is redistributing, it means empires are trembling, it means the future will not look like the past. No calls, no deals, just India's sovereign decision. That's not just a statement, that's a revolution. A revolution of thought, a revolution of pride, a revolution of destiny, and revolutions, once they begin, cannot be stopped. They spread, they inspire, they redefine what is possible, and right now, the world is watching one of the greatest revolutions of sovereignty in modern history. India is leading it, and nothing will be the same again. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine backed by innovation. The essence of India's rise is not confrontation, but conviction, the ability to act in its own interest without external validation. That one line captures the entire transformation of India's journey, because what the world is witnessing today is not a nation desperate to prove its strength by fighting, not a country rushing to show off power through aggression, but a civilization slowly and steadily shaping a doctrine of strength that is grounded in self-belief and innovation. For too long, India was portrayed as the land of responses, a country that would only act when provoked, a nation that could be pressured into hesitation when confronted with great powers. But those days are fading. The real shift is happening not on battlefields, but in the way India thinks about power, strategy, and sovereignty. When you examine the foundations of this change, you realize that India's military doctrine is no longer about survival alone. It is about creating an independent framework of action where choices are not dictated by foreign powers, where strategies are not borrowed from imported textbooks, but are rooted in the realities of India's geography, its civilizational philosophy, and its technological edge. Innovation has become the backbone of this doctrine. This is why missiles like Agni, BrahMos, and Akash are not just weapons. They are symbols of a decision to refuse dependence. The development of homegrown fighter jets like Tejas, the deployment of aircraft carriers like INS Vikrant, the strengthening of cyber and space defense. Each of these steps represents conviction, not confrontation. India is saying, we will not borrow your shield, we will forge our own. We will not rent protection. We will build it within conviction matters more than confrontation, because confrontation burns resources, but conviction builds them. Confrontation seeks validation through conflict, but conviction seeks strength through self-reliance. This is why India is cautious yet assertive. When provoked, India does not leap recklessly, but it also no longer steps back in hesitation. The Balakot airstrikes, the surgical strikes, the Galwan response, all of these demonstrated that India will not initiate reckless wars, but it will not tolerate bullying either. That balance is conviction. It is the ability to choose without fear of judgment, without waiting for approval from Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. It is sovereignty turned into action. The real genius is how conviction is expressed through innovation. In the past, military strength was measured by how many tanks you could buy, how many planes you could import, how many nuclear warheads you could count. But India realized that dependency was a trap. Every time you bought from someone else, you handed over leverage. Every time you outsourced your defense, you gave away sovereignty. That is why innovation became central. Indigenous production is not just about saving money, it is about psychological power. When an Indian soldier stands on the border with a rifle made in India, when an Indian pilot flies a jet designed and engineered by Indian scientists, when an Indian naval officer commands a ship built in an Indian dockyard, that soldier, that pilot, that officer carries more than just a weapon. They carry the weight of conviction. They know their strength was not borrowed. It was built. And that pride is a force multiplier more powerful than numbers. Conviction also means acting in your own interest without external validation. This is where India has broken away from the old world order. Previously, every move was judged by how the West responded, how global media framed it, how allies perceived it. But today, India calculates differently. If a decision serves India's interests, it moves forward regardless of who frowns. That is why India continues to buy oil from Russia despite Western sanctions. That is why India strengthens defense ties with the United States without alienating Russia. That is why India maintains dialogue with Iran even while partnering with Israel. It's not about taking sides, it's about taking India's side. That is conviction. It is not the arrogance of isolation, but the maturity of sovereignty. You see, confrontation is loud. It shouts, it threatens, it flexes, but conviction is quiet. It doesn't need to announce itself. It shows up in action. When India launches a satellite into space, it doesn't do it to provoke anyone. It does it because it believes in its own path. When India tests a missile, it isn't begging for recognition. It's preparing for the future. Conviction builds a calm confidence. It's the difference between a boxer swinging wildly in the ring and a disciplined fighter who knows exactly when to strike. The world is learning that India is that disciplined fighter. Patient, resilient, and precise. What does this mean for the future global order? It means India has become unpredictable in the best possible way, not reckless, but independent. Other nations cannot assume India will fall in line with this bloc or that bloc. They cannot assume India will always say yes to pressure. They cannot assume India's choices are up for sale. This unpredictability makes India powerful because it forces others to treat India with respect. You cannot manipulate a country that isn't desperate for your validation. You cannot control a nation that acts from conviction. That is why global powers are now approaching India differently. They negotiate, not dictate. They listen, not lecture, because they know India's doctrine is its own, and no phone call can rewrite it. But let's not pretend this was easy. Conviction is expensive. Building indigenous technology takes time, effort, and resources. Rejecting shortcuts means years of delay and criticism. Standing firm against pressure invites threats and attempts at isolation. Yet India chose that path because it understood something fundamental. Sovereignty without conviction is a shell. It looks strong, but it's hollow. Only when a nation makes decisions for itself, by itself, without needing applause or permission, does sovereignty become real. And India is turning that into reality. The cultural dimension of this conviction cannot be ignored. India's doctrine is not just built on machines and missiles, but on a civilizational memory that spans thousands of years. A memory that whispers, we have faced invasions, colonization, exploitation, but we are still here. Others rose and fell, but we endured. That memory creates a conviction no imported weapon can replace. It creates an inner strength that says, we do not need to prove ourselves to anyone. We know who we are. That is why India doesn't need to march into conflicts to feel powerful. Its power comes from knowing it has survived the test of time and is now entering an era where it dictates its own future, and that's why the world is watching closely. Because conviction, once it takes root, spreads beyond defense. It seeps into economics, into diplomacy, into culture. That's why India can push for rupee trade instead of dollar dependence. That's why India can host the G20 and set its own agenda instead of following someone else's script. That's why India can stand firm at the UN and call out hypocrisy without blinking. These are not acts of confrontation. They are acts of conviction. They say, we will do what is right for us, and if the world respects it, good. If not, we still move forward. This is the silent revolution shaping global power. Not the revolution of armies clashing, but of nations refusing to bow. India is leading that revolution, and the foundation of it all is conviction, an unshakable belief in its right to decide, its ability to innovate, its destiny to rise, and its refusal to wait for external validation before taking the next step. That conviction, more than any missile or tank, is what makes India unstoppable.